Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey that will completely shatter everything you thought you knew about royalty. What if I told you that the most beautiful queens in history, the women we admire in paintings and movies, rarely bathed? What if the very same hands that signed treaties and wore million-dollar jewels were crawling with lice? And here's the kicker. What if their breath was so foul that courtiers had to stand several feet away during conversations? I know it sounds impossible. After all, we've been fed this fairy tale image of pristine princesses and glamorous queens our entire lives. But tonight, I'm going to pull back the velvet curtain and show you the shocking, disgusting, and sometimes deadly truth about royal hygiene. We're talking about practices so revolting that they would make a modern teenager's messy room look like a medical facility. Picture this. Queen Elizabeth I, arguably one of history's most powerful women, had teeth so black and rotting that foreign ambassadors wrote home in horror. Marie Antoinette's legendary hair was so filthy and infested that servants had to use special tools just to get near her scalp. And don't even get me started on what royal women did during their monthly cycles. It's worse than your worst nightmare. So before we dive deeper into these royal secrets together, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. But only if you're genuinely curious about the wild truths I'm about to share. And hey, I'm always curious. Where are you watching from tonight? Your bedroom? Living room? Maybe you're already under those cozy blankets. Drop a comment and let me know. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's uncover these shocking royal secrets that history tried to hide. You see, there's this massive misconception that's been floating around for centuries. We look at those gorgeous oil paintings hanging in museums. You know the ones, where queens look absolutely radiant with porcelain skin and elaborate gowns. And we assume they lived lives of luxury and cleanliness. Hollywood has only made this worse. Every period drama shows us these perfectly groomed royal women who seem to have stepped out of a modern spa. But here's what they don't tell you in those movies. Here's what those portrait artists conveniently left out. The reality behind palace walls was so shocking that if you transported any of these royal women to modern times, they'd probably be refused service at your local McDonald's due to health code violations. Let me paint you a different picture. Imagine walking into Versailles during its golden age. The halls are magnificent, covered in gold and crystal chandeliers that cost more than entire villages. But then you catch a whiff of something wrong. It's not just one smell, it's layers upon layers of human filth, rotting food, unwashed bodies, and things I probably shouldn't mention while you're trying to relax. The truth is, royalty lived by completely different rules when it came to personal hygiene, and I'm not talking about minor differences. I'm talking about practices that would horrify a modern 5-year-old. We're going to explore 10 specific hygiene disasters that were not only common, but actually considered normal, even fashionable, among the most powerful women in history. Tonight, we'll discover why Queen Isabella of Spain was actually proud of only bathing twice in her entire lifetime. We'll learn about the deadly makeup that literally poisoned queens from the inside out. We'll explore the medieval belief that water was dangerous to human health, and how this led to some of the most disgusting beauty routines you could imagine. But here's what makes this story even more fascinating and slightly terrifying. These women weren't just random people making bad choices. They were the trendsetters of their time, whatever they did. Thousands of other noble women copied. Their disgusting habits became the gold standard of high society. Their poor hygiene wasn't seen as gross. It was seen as sophisticated, refined, and worthy of imitation. And the crazy part, some of these practices were so embedded in royal culture that they lasted for centuries. We're talking about hygiene disasters that were passed down from mother to daughter, from queen to princess, like precious family heirlooms. Except instead of jewels or crowns, they were passing down lice, disease, and some seriously questionable life choices. As we journey through these 10 shocking practices together, you'll start to understand how the pressure to maintain royal appearances led to some of the most counterproductive and dangerous beauty routines in human history. you'll see how the pursuit of status and elegance somehow resulted in the exact opposite: disease, disfigurement, and in some tragic cases, death. But don't worry, this isn't just going to be 2 hours of me grossing you out, though I'll definitely do some of that. This is a story about human nature, about how social pressure can make us do the most irrational things, and about how far people will go to fit in with their peers. It's about the gap between public image and private reality, a gap that was never wider than it was in royal palaces. So get ready, because our first stop on this shocking journey is going to reveal the deadly secret behind those flawless white faces you see in every royal portrait. We're about to discover how the pursuit of pale perfection led to a beauty trend so toxic that it literally poisoned the women who used it. And trust me, when you hear about Queen Elizabeth's daily makeup routine, you'll never look at those museum paintings the same way again. Picture yourself standing in front of Queen Elizabeth I's vanity mirror on any given morning in 1588. What you're about to witness would make a modern makeup artist faint on the spot, because the foundation of royal beauty, literally, was built on a substance so toxic that it slowly murdered the women who wore it. Let me tell you about ceruse, the deadliest beauty trend in royal history. This wasn't just any makeup. This was the ultimate status symbol, the Chanel No. 5 of the Renaissance era. And its main ingredient? Pure white lead mixed with vinegar. Yes, you heard that right. The same lead that we now know causes brain damage, organ failure, and death was being slathered on royal faces every single day. But here's where it gets really wild. The whiter your face, the more noble you were considered. Think about it. If you had a tan, it meant you worked outdoors like a peasant. And if your skin was ghostly pale, almost translucent, it screamed that you were wealthy enough to stay indoors all day, protected from the sun. So these royal women were literally poisoning themselves to prove they didn't have to work for a living. Queen Elizabeth herself was obsessed with this look. Historical accounts describe her face as being painted so white that it looked like a mask. Venetian ambassadors wrote back to their courts describing her appearance as frightening and unnatural. But Elizabeth didn't care. She applied this toxic mixture every single morning for over 4 decades. Now, let me walk you through what a typical morning looked like for Elizabeth. Her ladies-in-waiting would arrive at dawn with their deadly concoctions. First, they'd apply a base layer of ceruse, which was basically lead paint for faces. The mixture was so thick that it had to be applied with brushes, not fingers, because direct contact could cause immediate skin irritation. But wait, it gets worse. To create that perfect porcelain doll effect, they'd often apply multiple layers. Each layer had to dry completely before the next one went on, which meant Elizabeth would sit motionless for hours while poison dried on her face. Can you imagine? Hours of your life, every single day, slowly coating yourself in a substance that was killing you cell by cell. And the irony is absolutely heartbreaking. The very makeup that was supposed to make these women beautiful was destroying their beauty from the inside out. Lead poisoning causes hair loss, so their gorgeous locks would start falling out. It causes skin damage, so their complexions became worse, requiring even more makeup to cover the damage. It was a vicious, deadly cycle. The side effects were horrifying, and they were well documented by court physicians. Royal women using ceruse regularly suffered from what we now recognize as classic lead poisoning symptoms. We're talking about severe stomach pains that would double them over during important state ceremonies, sudden fits of rage that would come out of nowhere, causing these normally composed queens to scream at their servants over minor issues. But perhaps the most tragic part was the cognitive decline. Lead poisoning affects the brain, causing confusion, memory loss, and difficulty making decisions. Imagine being a queen, responsible for an entire kingdom, while slowly losing your mental faculties to your daily beauty routine. There are documented cases of royal women forgetting the names of their own children, losing track of important political negotiations, all because they were literally painting poison on their faces every morning. Elizabeth's own physician, a man named William Gilbert, wrote in his private journals about his concerns regarding the Queen's daily beauty ritual. He noted that by her later years, Elizabeth's hands would shake uncontrollably, a classic sign of lead poisoning, but he could never directly tell the Queen to stop, because questioning royal beauty practices was essentially questioning the monarchy itself. Here's what makes this even more devastating. The beauty industry of the time knew exactly what they were selling. Lead-based cosmetics weren't some accidental poisoning. Makeup manufacturers were fully aware that their products were toxic, but the demand from royal courts was so high and the profits so enormous that they kept producing these deadly concoctions anyway. The recipe for ceruse was actually a closely guarded secret, passed down through generations of court cosmetic makers. It typically consisted of white lead carbonate mixed with vinegar, sometimes with added ingredients like egg whites or ground pearls for extra luxury. The more expensive versions contained actual silver particles, making them even more toxic, but also more prestigious. And this wasn't just an English problem. Across European courts, from France to Spain to Austria, royal women were all following the same deadly beauty trend. Catherine de' Medici in France was known to apply ceruse so thickly that courtiers joked her face looked like a painted statue. Diane de Poitiers, the famous mistress of King Henry II, was so devoted to her white lead makeup that when her body was exhumed in 2009, scientists found dangerous levels of lead in her hair samples over 450 years after her death. But here's the part that really gets me. These women weren't stupid. They were highly educated, politically savvy, and surrounded by the best physicians of their time. Yet the social pressure to maintain that perfect pale complexion was so intense that they chose beauty over health, status over survival. The tragic irony is that the very thing meant to preserve their youth and beauty was aging them rapidly and destroying their health. By the time Elizabeth died at age 69, her face was described as being covered in deep wrinkles and scars, the exact opposite of the timeless beauty she'd been chasing her entire life. Now, you might be wondering how long this deadly trend lasted. Surely people caught on eventually, right? Well, that's where our story takes an even more shocking turn. Because while Elizabeth was slowly poisoning herself with lead-based makeup, her hair was hiding secrets that were equally disturbing and far more disgusting than you could possibly imagine. What I'm about to tell you about royal hair care will make you want to immediately wash your own hair 3 times. Because when it comes to the most famous hairstyles in history, those towering, elaborate creations we see in paintings, the shocking truth is that they were rarely, if ever, washed. And the consequences were absolutely revolting. Let's start with the most iconic hair in royal history, Marie Antoinette's legendary pouf. You know, those impossibly high sculptural hairstyles that seem to defy gravity. Well, here's what your history books didn't tell you. Marie Antoinette washed her hair exactly 4 times per year. 4 times in an entire year. Let that sink in for a moment. But it gets so much worse. Those magnificent hairstyles that took hours to create weren't just dirty. They were ecosystems. I'm talking about living, breathing communities of insects, rodents, and bacteria that called royal hair home. Court records from Versailles describe servants finding everything from lice and fleas to actual mice living in noble women's hairstyles. Now, you might be wondering how this was even possible. How do you go months without washing your hair and still look presentable? Well, the secret weapon of 18th century royal hair care was a combination that would horrify any modern stylist. Animal fat, flour, and powder. Lots and lots of powder. The process was absolutely disgusting. First, servants would coat the hair with pig fat or beef tallow. Yes, actual animal grease, to make it hold its shape. Then they'd dust it with wheat flour to absorb some of the oil and give it texture. Finally, they'd cover the entire creation with white or grey powder made from ground rice or wheat starch. The result? Hair so stiff and solid that it could maintain its shape for weeks at a time. Marie Antoinette's hairdresser, a man named Léonard Autier, actually wrote detailed instructions for maintaining these creations. His notes. which survive to this day, recommend refreshing the hairstyle by adding more powder every few days and using long hairpins to reorganize any displaced sections. Notice how he never once mentions washing. But here's where things get truly nightmarish. Because these hairstyles were so elaborate and time-consuming to create, royal women would sleep sitting up for weeks to avoid disturbing them. They had special chairs designed for sleeping upright, and they'd wrap their heads in silk scarves to protect the style. Can you imagine sleeping sitting up for 3 weeks straight just to keep your hairdo intact? The French court actually had a term for this practice, préservation de coiffure, which literally means preservation of the hairstyle. And preserving these styles meant accepting some truly horrifying consequences. Court physicians' records describe royal women suffering from severe neck pain, headaches, and something they called hair fever, which we now know was probably infection from the bacteria breeding in their unwashed scalps. Let me tell you about one particularly disturbing incident that happened to the Duchess of Devonshire in 1778. She had maintained one of these elaborate poof hairstyles for nearly 6 weeks, when she began experiencing what she described as movement in her hair during a formal dinner. When her ladies-in-waiting finally dismantled the style later that evening, they discovered an entire family of mice had built a nest in the structure, complete with baby mice. The Duchess wrote about this experience in a letter to her sister, saying, "I fear I have been hosting uninvited guests for some time. The shame is unbearable. Yet I confess I am not alone in this predicament." That last line is key. She wasn't alone. This was happening to royal women across Europe. But wait, there's more. The animal fat used to style these elaborate creations would go rancid after just a few days. Imagine the smell. Weeks-old pig fat mixed with flour paste, unwashed human hair, and whatever insects had decided to move in. Court records describe visitors to Versailles commenting on the distinctive aroma that followed certain noble ladies wherever they went. The powder situation was equally revolting. By the 1770s, Marie Antoinette was using up to 3 pounds of powder per styling session. That's 3 pounds of starch sitting on top of weeks-old grease and unwashed hair. When it rained, the powder would turn into a paste-like substance that would drip down their faces and necks, often staining their elaborate gowns. And here's something that'll really gross you out. The longer these styles lasted, the more prestigious they became. Having hair that could maintain its shape for months was seen as the ultimate display of wealth and sophistication. It showed that you had enough servants to maintain the style, enough money to afford the expensive powders and pomades, and enough leisure time to sit for hours while it was being constructed. The competition between royal women over who could maintain their hairstyle the longest became absolutely fierce. The Countess of Polignac, one of Marie Antoinette's closest friends, allegedly kept the same hairstyle for 11 weeks in 1782. By the end of that period, court gossips reported that she had to hold a perfumed handkerchief over her head whenever she entered a room, to mask the smell of her own hair. But perhaps the most shocking part of this whole story is that these women knew exactly how disgusting their hair situation was. Private letters between noble ladies are filled with complaints about itching, smells, and unwanted residents in their hair. Yet they continued the practice because the social pressure was so intense that having clean hair was actually seen as a sign of poor breeding. Marquise de Pompadour, Louis XV's famous mistress, wrote in her diary about the necessary sacrifices of beauty, specifically referring to the discomfort and hygiene issues associated with maintaining court hairstyles. She described the experience as enduring temporary unpleasantness for lasting admiration. Now, you might think this madness was limited to France, but you'd be wrong. Across the English Channel, Georgian ladies were following similar practices. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu wrote extensively about the London method of hair care, which involved washing hair only quarterly and maintaining styles with pomatum, a scented grease made from pig fat and rose water. The irony is absolutely mind-blowing. These women were spending fortunes on the finest silks, the most precious jewels, and the most luxurious cosmetics. Yet they were walking around with hair that would make a homeless person feel superior about their hygiene. They were literally wearing their wealth while their scalps rotted underneath. But if you think unwashed hair was the worst of royal hygiene disasters, you're in for a truly shocking revelation. Because when we look inside these royal mouths, we discover dental practices so horrifying that they make everything we've discussed so far seem almost pleasant by comparison. Imagine opening your mouth to speak and watching everyone in the room immediately take a step backward. That was the reality for many royal women, whose dental hygiene was so catastrophically bad that their breath could literally clear a room. But the visual horror of their teeth? That was somehow even worse than the smell. Queen Elizabeth I had what Spanish ambassador Count de Feria described as teeth like black tombstones rising from a swamp. And he wasn't being poetic. He was being frighteningly literal. By her 40s, Elizabeth's teeth had turned completely black from decay, and by her 60s, she had lost so many teeth that foreign dignitaries struggled to understand her speech during important negotiations. But here's the twisted irony that'll blow your mind. Elizabeth's rotten teeth were actually a status symbol, because in Tudor England, sugar was so expensive that only the wealthy could afford to destroy their teeth with it. Having black, rotting teeth literally proved you were rich enough to eat yourself into dental disaster. Poor people, who couldn't afford sugar, actually had much better teeth than royalty. Let me paint you a picture of what a typical royal mouth looked like in the 16th and 17th centuries. We're talking about teeth so decayed that they were often just broken stumps poking through inflamed, bleeding gums. The pain must have been absolutely excruciating. Yet these women continued consuming massive amounts of sugar because stopping would have been social suicide. Elizabeth consumed what historians estimate to be about 2 pounds of sugar per week, an astronomical amount by any standard. Their favourite treats included candied violets, sugared almonds, and something called banqueting stuff, which was basically pure sugar formed into decorative shapes. Contemporary accounts describe her constantly sucking on sugar lozenges during court proceedings, even while conducting affairs of state. The dental care available to royalty was, if anything, worse than having no dental care at all. Royal dentists, I use that term very loosely, had exactly 3 tools at their disposal: pulling, burning, and praying. When a tooth became too painful to bear, their solution was to yank it out with primitive pliers, often taking chunks of jawbone with it. But the treatments they offered were absolutely horrifying. One popular remedy involved burning the gums with hot irons to cauterize the rot. Another favorite was to drill holes in healthy teeth and stuff them with lead. Yes, the same lead they were putting on their faces, believing this would prevent decay from spreading. Catherine de' Medici took dental horror to an entirely new level. Historical records show that she underwent what was essentially medieval root canals, performed without any anesthesia whatsoever. Court physicians would drill into her infected teeth using hand-cracked metal bits, then pack the holes with a mixture of crushed pearls and mercury. The agony must have been indescribable. Yet she endured these procedures multiple times because the alternative, being seen with missing teeth, was unthinkable. The French court actually developed an elaborate system of dental camouflage. Royal women would stuff their mouths with small cloths soaked in perfume to mask the smell of decay, and they learned to speak and smile in ways that would minimize the visibility of their rotting teeth. There are detailed etiquette manuals from Versailles that include instructions on proper mouth positioning for ladies of declining dental fortune. But perhaps the most disturbing trend was the practice of dental transplantation. Wealthy royal women would actually purchase healthy teeth from poor people, often young servants or peasants, and have them surgically implanted into their own mouths. The procedures were performed without sterilization or proper medical knowledge, leading to horrific infections that often killed both the donor and the recipient. Queen Anne of England was particularly notorious for these dental transplants. She reportedly went through dozens of donor teeth during her lifetime, as the transplanted teeth would inevitably become infected and fall out within weeks. Her personal physician, Dr. John Woodall, kept detailed records of these procedures, describing them as necessary vanities that oft prove fatal. The pain these royal women endured was beyond comprehension. Elizabeth's personal secretary, William Cecil, wrote in his private diary about the Queen's tooth days, periods when her dental pain was so severe that she couldn't eat solid food or speak clearly. During these episodes, which could last for weeks, all court business would essentially grind to a halt because the Queen was incapacitated by agony. And here's something that really puts their priorities in perspective. These women would rather suffer unimaginable pain than give up their social status. Elizabeth reportedly told her closest advisor that she would endure any torment rather than appear common. The pressure to maintain royal appearances was so intense that they chose prolonged torture over social embarrassment. The smell situation was equally horrific. Contemporary accounts describe the breath of royal women as being so foul that courtiers would hold perfumed handkerchiefs over their noses during conversations. The Spanish ambassador to Elizabeth's court wrote that approaching the Queen for an audience was like entering a charnel house where the dead had been left to rot. The visual aspect was somehow even worse than the smell. Portrait artists of the era actually developed techniques to paint royal women with their mouths closed, because showing their teeth would have been considered insulting to the monarchy. There's not a single formal portrait of Elizabeth from her later years that shows her teeth, despite the fact that earlier portraits often featured her smile. The social implications were staggering. Royal marriages were often negotiated sight unseen, and many foreign princes got the shock of their lives when they met their intended brides. Henry IV of France reportedly fainted when he first saw his bride-to-be, Marie de Medici, smile during their wedding ceremony. The poor man simply wasn't prepared for the dental horror that awaited him. What makes this even more tragic is that these royal women were often highly intelligent, well-educated individuals who were capable of running entire kingdoms. Yet they were essentially disabled by their own dental disasters. Elizabeth, despite being one of the most powerful monarchs in history, spent the last decades of her life in constant pain, struggling to eat, speak, and maintain her royal duties. The irony is that while these royal women were destroying their teeth with expensive sugar, the common people they ruled over had much better dental health simply because they couldn't afford the luxury of tooth decay. It was literally a case where wealth bought suffering and poverty preserved health. But even as royal mouths were rotting from the inside out, there was an even more fundamental hygiene disaster happening that affected their entire bodies. Because while we've been focused on faces, hair, and teeth, we haven't yet talked about the one thing that might be the most shocking of all, their relationship with water itself. Here's a statement that will absolutely blow your mind. Queen Isabella of Castile, one of the most powerful monarchs in European history, the woman who funded Christopher Columbus's voyage to the New World, proudly boasted that she had only bathed twice in her entire life. Twice, in 73 years of existence. And she considered this a virtue. But Isabella wasn't some medieval anomaly. She was actually following the medical advice of her time, because in royal courts across Europe, water was considered one of the most dangerous substances on Earth. Royal physicians genuinely believed that bathing could kill you, and they had elaborate medical theories to prove it. Let me take you into the mind of a 15th century royal doctor. They believed that human skin had tiny pores that, when exposed to water, would open up and allow deadly diseases to enter the body. They called this corrupt air penetration. And they were absolutely convinced that a single bath could lead to plague, consumption, or instant death. So these royal women weren't just being lazy. They were literally following doctors' orders when they avoided water. The medical establishment of the time taught that the human body had a natural protective layer of oils and dirt that acted like armor against disease. Washing this away was considered medical suicide. Court physicians would prescribe dry cleaning instead, rubbing the body with linen cloths to remove surface dirt while preserving the essential protective barrier. Isabella's famous bathing record, once at birth and once before her wedding, was actually held up as a model of perfect health maintenance. She lived to be 73 in an era when most people died before 40, so in the minds of medieval doctors, her bathing avoidance was proof that their theories were correct. But here's where it gets even more bizarre. Royal courts developed an entire alternative hygiene system based on avoiding water at all costs. Instead of bathing, royal women would undergo elaborate dry cleaning rituals that were somehow supposed to be more hygienic than actually washing with water. These dry cleaning sessions were absolutely ridiculous. Servants would rub the royal body with expensive imported linen soaked in rosewater, wine, or even urine. Yes, urine. Because these liquids were considered safer than plain water. The process could take hours, as servants meticulously wiped down every inch of royal skin while the queen lay motionless on special tables designed for this purpose. Queen Anne of Brittany took this to an extreme level. Her daily hygiene routine, documented in detail by her ladies-in-waiting, involved being rubbed down with silk cloth soaked in wine from her personal vineyard. She believed that the alcohol in the wine would kill germs while the silk would polish her skin to perfection. The result? She smelled like a winery and felt constantly sticky, but she was convinced she was the cleanest person in France. The French court under Louis XIV developed what they called la toilette sèche, the dry toilet. This was an elaborate ceremony where the king or queen would be cleaned without a drop of water touching their skin. Servants would use silk brushes to remove dead skin, followed by perfumed powders to absorb oils, and finally scented ointments to seal in the natural protective barriers. But the most shocking part of this waterphobia was how it affected royal women during childbirth. Medieval medical texts specifically warned against allowing new mothers to bathe for at least 40 days after giving birth, believing that water exposure during this vulnerable period would cause immediate death. So these women would go through the trauma of medieval childbirth and then lie in their own filth for over a month because their doctors told them that cleaning themselves would be fatal. Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife, endured 6 pregnancies following these water avoidance protocols. Her personal physician, Dr. Fernando Vitoria, kept detailed notes about her post-birth care, which included strict instructions to preserve the childbed humours through avoidance of aquatic contamination. Translation: don't let her wash herself under any circumstances. The irony is absolutely staggering. These royal women were surrounded by the finest luxuries money could buy: silk sheets, golden chambers, armies of servants. Yet they were living in conditions that would horrify a modern homeless shelter, and they thought they were being sophisticated and medical about it. The smell must have been absolutely overwhelming. Contemporary accounts describe royal courts as having a distinctive aroma that could be detected from several rooms away. Ambassadors from cleaner cultures would often comment on the pungent atmosphere of European palaces. The Moroccan ambassador to the French court in 1699 wrote that the Christians emit such odours that one wonders how they can bear each other's company. But here's what really gets me. These royal women actually developed a hierarchy based on how bad they smelled. The stronger your natural aroma, the more it proved you were following proper medical protocols. Having a strong body odour was literally a status symbol, because it showed you were wealthy enough to afford the best medical advice and disciplined enough to follow it. Royal perfume wasn't used to smell good, it was used to smell different. The goal wasn't to mask body odour, but to create complex scent combinations that would distinguish royal smells from common smells. Marie de Medici reportedly spent more on perfumes than some nobles spent on their entire estates, not to smell clean, but to smell uniquely royal. The waterphobia extended to drinking as well. Royal women were often discouraged from drinking plain water, which was considered dangerous for internal consumption. Instead, they drank wine, beer, or heavily spiced beverages that were supposed to be safer for royal constitutions. This led to a whole other set of health problems, but at least they weren't risking the deadly dangers of H2O. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of this entire situation was that these intelligent, powerful women were essentially prisoners of medical misinformation. Queen Isabella conquered kingdoms, negotiated international treaties, and changed the course of world history. Yet she was afraid to take a bath because her doctors told her it would kill her. The rare occasions when royal women did encounter water were treated like medical emergencies. When Princess Isabella of Portugal accidentally fell into a fountain during a court celebration in 1523, her entire medical team rushed to treat what they considered a potentially fatal exposure. She was immediately wrapped in heated blankets, fed warming spices, and kept under medical observation for weeks to watch for signs of water poisoning. Yet despite all this water avoidance, there was one aspect of royal hygiene that was even more shocking than their bathing habits. Because when these women needed to address their beauty concerns, they turned to substances that made dirty buzzwater look like a health tonic. They were about to embark on beauty treatments so toxic and dangerous that they make everything we've discussed so far seem almost reasonable. When royal women couldn't achieve beauty through cleanliness, they turned to chemistry, and the results were absolutely lethal. We're about to dive into beauty treatments so toxic that they make modern horror movies look like children's cartoons. Because these queens weren't just applying makeup, they were essentially conducting chemical warfare on their own bodies. Let me introduce you to Diane de Poitiers, the mistress of King Henry II of France, who was considered the most beautiful woman of her era. Her secret: she drank liquid gold every single morning for over 30 years. Not metaphorical gold, actual, literal gold dissolved in the various potions that she believed would preserve her youth forever. When scientists exhumed her body in 2008, they found gold levels in her hair that were 500 times higher than normal human levels. But Diane's gold consumption was just the beginning of royal beauty madness. These women were ingesting and applying substances that would be classified as chemical weapons by today's standards: mercury, arsenic, antimony, lead, if it was toxic. They put it on their faces or drank it for beauty. Mercury was particularly popular for treating what they delicately called complexion issues. Royal women suffering from syphilis, which was rampant in European courts due to their, shall we say, flexible moral standards, would undergo mercury treatments that were supposed to clear their skin. The process involved sitting in sealed chambers while mercury was heated below them, allowing the toxic vapors to penetrate their skin. The side effects were absolutely horrifying. Mercury poisoning causes tremors, so these women would develop uncontrollable shaking. It causes tooth loss, adding to their already catastrophic dental problems. It affects the brain, leading to what court physicians called mercury madness, sudden fits of rage, paranoia, and bizarre behavior that would last for days. Catherine de Medici was notorious for her mercury treatments. Court records describe her weekly purification sessions, where she would be sealed in a cabinet lined with mirrors while mercury was vaporized below. She believed the mercury vapors would not only cure her skin problems, but also preserve her beauty indefinitely. The reality, by her 50s, she was suffering from severe neurological damage that made her appear drunk during important state functions. But if you think mercury was bad, wait until you hear about arsenic beauty treatments. Renaissance royal women discovered that small doses of arsenic could create a translucent, porcelain-like complexion that was highly prized in court circles. So they began taking what they called arsenic complexion pills, literally poisoning themselves for beauty. The Borgias, that infamous Italian royal family, were particularly obsessed with arsenic beauty treatments. Lucrezia Borgia reportedly took arsenic pills daily from the age of 14 until her death at 39. Her contemporaries described her as having an almost supernatural beauty, skin so pale it seemed to glow from within. What they were actually seeing was the early stages of chronic arsenic poisoning, which causes a distinctive pallor that was mistaken for ethereal beauty. Here's where it gets really twisted. These arsenic treatments actually worked in the short term. Small doses of arsenic do create a pale, almost translucent skin tone that was considered the height of beauty in Renaissance Europe. So these women saw immediate results and assumed they'd discovered the secret to eternal youth. What they didn't realize was that they were slowly murdering themselves. The French court developed an entire arsenic beauty industry. Madame de Montespan, Louis XIV's most famous mistress, employed a team of alchemists who created personalized arsenic formulations based on her skin type and beauty goals. These beauty chemists would adjust the arsenic concentration depending on whether she wanted to achieve morning glow, evening radiance, or ball perfection. But the most shocking arsenic story belongs to Lady Frances Howard, who became obsessed with achieving the perfect pale complexion for her wedding to the Earl of Somerset. She began taking increasingly large doses of arsenic pills, convinced that more poison would equal more beauty. By her wedding day, she had achieved the ghostly pale look she desired, but she was also suffering from severe internal damage. She died less than 2 years later, and her autopsy revealed arsenic levels that would have killed a horse. The antimony craze was equally deadly. This metallic element was used to create coal-like eye makeup that was supposed to make the eyes appear larger and more luminous. Royal women would apply antimony directly to their eyelids, and even inside their eyes, believing it would enhance their natural beauty. The Duchess of Marlborough was famous for her antimony eye treatments. She would have servants apply liquid antimony to her eyes every morning, often causing severe irritation and temporary blindness. But she continued the practice for decades because she believed it gave her eyes a supernatural sparkle that no other woman could achieve. What makes all of this even more disturbing is that these women knew their beauty treatments were dangerous. Court physicians regularly documented the side effects: hair loss, skin discoloration, neurological problems, organ damage. Yet the treatments continued because the social pressure to maintain beauty was more powerful than the fear of death. Queen Anna of Poland actually kept a detailed diary of her beauty treatment side effects, documenting everything from mercury-induced tremors to arsenic-related stomach pains. Yet she continued her toxic beauty routine for over 20 years because, as she wrote, to appear common is a fate worse than death, and death may be avoided, but commonness cannot. The beauty chemical industry that grew up around royal courts was essentially a network of legalized poisoners. These beauty alchemists would create custom toxic formulations for their royal clients, experimenting with different combinations of deadly substances to achieve specific aesthetic effects. They were literally conducting human experiments on some of the most powerful women in Europe. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of this toxic beauty obsession was how it affected royal decision-making. These women were running entire kingdoms while slowly poisoning themselves with beauty treatments. Their judgment was impaired by chronic toxic exposure. Their health was deteriorating, and their pain levels were off the charts. Yet they were expected to make decisions that affected millions of people. The irony is heartbreaking. These royal women had access to the finest education, the best advisors, and unlimited resources. Yet they chose to slowly kill themselves with beauty treatments because the alternative, appearing less than perfect, was socially unacceptable. And speaking of socially unacceptable, there's one aspect of royal life that was even more shocking than their toxic beauty routines. Because while these women were poisoning themselves from the outside, there was something happening with their most basic clothing that would make a modern person question everything they thought they knew about royal sophistication. Beneath those magnificent gowns that cost more than their entire villages lay a secret so disgusting that it would make you grateful for modern laundry services. Because royal women, despite wearing the most expensive fabrics in the world, had a relationship with their undergarments that was absolutely revolting. Here's a fact that will change how you view every period drama forever. Most royal women owned only 1 or 2 sets of undergarments for their entire lives, and they would wear the same chemise, that's the basic undergarment that went directly against their skin, for months at a time without changing it. We're talking about 3, 4, sometimes 6 months of continuous wear. Queen Elizabeth owned exactly 3 chemises throughout her entire 45-year reign. 3. The royal laundry records from Greenwich Palace, which still exist today, show that these undergarments were washed approximately 4 times per year. That means Elizabeth wore the same sweat-soaked, body oil-saturated piece of linen against her skin for 3 months straight before it saw soap and water. But here's what makes this even more shocking. This wasn't poverty or laziness. This was actually considered proper royal behavior. Changing your undergarments frequently was seen as a sign of vanity and moral weakness. The longer you could wear the same chemise, the more it proved your spiritual discipline and noble character. The medieval church had actually convinced royal women that suffering in dirty undergarments was a form of religious devotion. They called it mortification of the flesh, and it was supposed to make them more holy and worthy of God's favour. So these queens were literally competing to see who could endure the most disgusting undergarment situation as proof of their spiritual superiority. Saint Margaret of Hungary, who was a royal princess before becoming a saint, was famous for wearing the same wool undergarment for 7 consecutive years without washing it once. When she finally died, her ladies-in-waiting reported that the garment had essentially fused with her skin and had to be carefully peeled away from her body. The church held this up as evidence of her extraordinary holiness. Now, let me paint you a picture of what these royal undergarments actually looked like after months of continuous wear. Contemporary descriptions from royal wardrobe inventories are absolutely horrifying. We're talking about fabric so stiff with accumulated body oils, sweat, and other bodily fluids that it could literally stand up on its own. Catherine of Aragon's wardrobe inventory, compiled after her death, describes her personal chemises as being of such firmness and discoloration as to require sharp implements for removal. The royal laundresses had developed special tools, essentially medieval crowbars, to pry these garments off royal bodies because the fabric had become so rigid and stuck to the skin. The smell situation was beyond description. Royal women would layer expensive perfumes and sachets of herbs throughout their gowns to mask the overwhelming stench emanating from their undergarments. But according to contemporary accounts, the smell would still seep through all those layers of silk and velvet, creating what one Spanish ambassador described as an aroma that follows Her Majesty like a faithful hound. But wait, it gets so much worse, because these unwashed undergarments weren't just dirty and smelly. They were breeding grounds for every parasite, bacteria, and infection you could imagine. Royal women lived in a constant state of what we would now recognize as severe skin infections, rashes, and infestations. Lice was so common in royal undergarments that court ladies actually had special ivory combs designed specifically for lice removal. These knit combs were often decorated with precious stones and were considered essential accessories for any well-dressed noblewoman. Having beautiful lice removal tools was literally a status symbol. Rita Medici's personal inventory lists no fewer than 12 jeweled and knit combs, each designed for different types of lice removal. She had diamond-encrusted combs for head lice, emerald-studded ones for body lice, and specially designed ruby combs for what the inventory delicately refers to as intimate parasites. The fact that she needed 12 different specialized tools tells you everything about the scope of her infestation problem. The flea situation was equally horrifying. Royal women would actually wear what they called flea furs, small pieces of fur sewn into their undergarments that were supposed to attract fleas away from their skin. The theory was that fleas preferred animal fur to human skin, so these fur patches would act like flea magnets, concentrating the insects in specific areas where they could be more easily removed. But here's the part that really gets me. These weren't desperate survival measures. These were luxury items. Wealthy royal women would pay enormous sums for exotic furs specifically to attract fleas in their undergarments. Ermine flea furs were particularly prized because they were both effective at attracting fleas and beautiful enough to show off to other noble ladies during private dressing ceremonies. The skin problems caused by these disgusting undergarment practices were legendary. Royal women suffered from what court physicians called chemise rot, severe skin infections caused by prolonged contact with dirty fabric. These infections would create open sores, rashes, and something truly horrifying called weeping skin, where infected areas would constantly ooze fluids. Anne of Cleves, Henry VIII's fourth wife, was documented as suffering from such severe chemise rot that she couldn't wear certain colours because the oozing from her skin infections would stain the fabric. Her personal physician, Dr. Butts, prescribed a treatment that involved rubbing raw garlic directly onto the infected areas, while she was still wearing the same dirty undergarment that had caused the infections in the first place. The social implications were staggering. Royal women would actually bond over their shared undergarment suffering. There are documented cases of noble ladies comparing their lice infestations, like we might compare jewellery today. Having particularly impressive parasites was seen as proof that you were following proper royal protocols. The Duchess of Burgundy wrote extensively in her private letters about what she called "my faithful companions," referring to the lice colony that had taken up permanent residence in her chemise. She described them with genuine affection, as if they were beloved pets rather than disease-carrying parasites. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this entire situation was how it affected royal health and longevity. These constant skin infections weakened their immune systems, made them more susceptible to serious diseases, and caused chronic pain that affected every aspect of their lives. Yet they continued to practice because changing your undergarments frequently was considered morally questionable. The laundry situation was its own nightmare. When royal undergarments were finally washed, remember, this happened maybe 4 times per year. The process was so disgusting that special servants had to be hired specifically for this task. These chemise washers were paid danger wages because the job was considered so revolting and potentially disease-inducing. The washing process itself was absolutely medieval. The garments would be soaked in lye so strong that it would burn the washer's hands, then beaten with wooden paddles to break up the accumulated filth. Even after this aggressive treatment, many garments never came completely clean, retaining permanent stains and odors that would last for the remainder of their use. What's truly tragic is that these royal women were making decisions that affected entire kingdoms, while dealing with constant physical discomfort from their disgusting undergarments. Imagine trying to negotiate international treaties while your skin is covered in infected sores from months-old dirty linen. Yet this was considered normal, even admirable behavior for royal women. But if you think their undergarment situation was the worst aspect of royal hygiene, you're about to discover medical practices that were so barbaric and counterproductive that they make dirty underwear seem like a minor inconvenience. Nothing could have prepared you for what royal women endured in the name of medical treatment and beauty enhancement. When these queens felt unwell or wanted to improve their appearance, they subjected themselves to procedures so barbaric that they make medieval torture devices look humane. We're talking about medical practices that were essentially legalized self-harm disguised as healthcare. Bloodletting was the crown jewel of royal medical treatment, and it was absolutely everywhere. Royal women would have their blood drained regularly, not because they were sick, but because their doctors believed that removing blood would make them more beautiful, healthier, and even more intelligent. Queen Catherine de' Medici had herself bled 3 times per week for over 30 years, losing what modern calculations estimate to be over 2,000 pints of blood during her lifetime. But here's the truly insane part. They weren't just making small cuts and collecting a little blood. These royal bloodletting sessions were like medieval horror movies. Court physicians would use devices called fleams, essentially medieval box cutters, to make deep incisions in royal arms, necks, and even foreheads. Then they'd attach brass cups to literally suck the blood out of these wounds. The process was agonizing and dangerous. Marie de' Medici's personal physician, Dr. Jean Riolan, kept detailed records of her bloodletting sessions. He described making incisions so deep that they required stitching afterward, and bleeding her until she lost consciousness, which he considered a sign that the treatment was working properly. She would often lose so much blood that she couldn't stand for days afterward. But if you think bloodletting was bad, wait until you hear about leech therapy. Royal women would have hundreds of live leeches applied to their faces and bodies, believing that these blood-sucking parasites would cure everything from headaches to bad complexions. The French court was particularly obsessed with facial leech treatments, where dozens of leeches would be attached to a royal woman's face while she sat motionless for hours. Catherine the Great of Russia was famous for her weekly facial leech sessions. She would have up to 50 leeches attached to her face at once, covering her forehead, cheeks, and neck. Court witnesses described her during these treatments as looking like a living nightmare, with black leeches writhing across her face while blood trickled down her neck. She endured this horror for decades because she believed it gave her skin a youthful glow. The medical theory behind all this bloodletting was something called balancing the humors. Royal physicians believed that human bodies contained 4 essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that illness and ugliness resulted from having too much of any one humour, since blood was considered the most dangerous humour to have in excess. Regular bleeding was prescribed for virtually every ailment, but the humour balancing treatments got even more disgusting. To reduce excess phlegm, royal women would undergo procedures designed to make them vomit for hours. They'd be given potions containing antimony, mercury, and other toxins that would cause violent, prolonged vomiting sessions that court physicians believed would purge their systems of disease-causing phlegm. Anne of Austria, Louis XIV's mother, famously underwent a vomiting treatment that lasted for 3 consecutive days. Her personal physician fed her increasingly powerful emetics, substances designed to cause vomiting, until she was bringing up blood. He recorded this as a successful treatment because, in his words, Her Majesty has expelled the corrupted humours that were causing her melancholy. The bile-balancing treatments were equally horrific. To purge excess yellow bile, royal women would take powerful laxatives that would cause uncontrollable diarrhea for days. These weren't gentle herbal remedies. These were brutal purgatives containing mercury, lead, and other toxic substances that would essentially poison the digestive system into violent evacuation. But perhaps the most disturbing treatments were those designed to balance black bile, which physicians believed caused depression and ugliness. These treatments involved deliberately inducing seizures in royal women through the use of electrical devices, toxic fumes, and physical shock. The theory was that violent convulsions would shake the black bile loose and restore mental and physical beauty. The Duchess of Orleans underwent regular seizure treatments administered by the royal physician Dr. Antoine Vallot. He would place her in a sealed chamber filled with burning sulfur fumes until she began convulsing, then apply electrical devices to her temples to intensify the seizures. She endured this treatment monthly for over 15 years because Dr. Vallot convinced her that it was preventing her from becoming ugly and insane. The pain levels these royal women endured during medical treatments were absolutely unimaginable. Remember, this was centuries before anesthesia, so every procedure was performed on fully conscious patients. Court records describe royal women screaming so loudly during treatments that their cries could be heard throughout entire palaces. But here's what really gets me. These women would often schedule their medical torture sessions around social events. Marie Antoinette would plan her bloodletting sessions for the day before important balls, believing that the blood loss would give her skin a fashionable pale complexion. She would literally drain herself nearly to unconsciousness as a beauty treatment. The infection rates from these procedures were staggering. Without sterilization or proper medical knowledge, royal women were constantly developing serious infections from their medical treatments. Open wounds from bloodletting would become septic. Leech bite marks would develop into abscesses, and the toxic substances used in purging treatments would cause organ damage. Queen Maria Theresa of Spain died from complications related to her medical treatments rather than from any actual disease. Her autopsy revealed that she had suffered massive internal damage from decades of mercury purging, lead-based medications, and repeated bloodletting. Her personal physician noted that her organs showed more damage from medical treatments than from natural aging. The most tragic aspect of this medical nightmare was that these treatments often made royal women sicker than they were before. A royal woman might visit her physician complaining of a minor headache and end up bedridden for weeks from the bloodletting and purging treatments prescribed to cure it. Yet they continued seeking these treatments because the alternative, appearing to neglect their health, was socially unacceptable. The competitive aspect of medical suffering was particularly disturbing. Royal women would actually brag about how much medical torture they could endure. Having the strength to survive extreme bloodletting or prolonged purging treatments was seen as proof of noble character and royal breeding. The Princess Palatine wrote extensively about what she called her medical victories, instances where she'd survived particularly brutal treatments that had incapacitated other court ladies. She described enduring a bloodletting session where she lost so much blood that she couldn't speak for 2 days as one of her proudest achievements. But even as these royal women were subjecting themselves to medieval medical torture in the name of health and beauty, there was an aspect of their daily lives that was even more shocking. Because when nature called, the solutions they came up with were so disgusting and impractical that they make everything we've discussed so far seem almost civilized. Brace yourself for the most stomach-churning chapter of our royal hygiene nightmare, because we're about to discuss what happened when nature called in the most magnificent palaces in history. The waste management situation in royal courts was so revolting that it would make a modern gas station restroom look like the Ritz-Carlton. Let's start with the Palace of Versailles, the crown jewel of European royal residences, home to the most powerful monarchs in the world. This magnificent palace, with its hall of mirrors and golden chambers, housed over 10,000 people at its peak. And here's the shocking truth. It had exactly 0 functioning toilets. None. Not a single proper bathroom for 10,000 residents. Instead, Versailles operated on what I can only describe as a human waste free-for-all. Courtiers, including the highest-ranking noble ladies, would simply relieve themselves wherever they happened to be when nature called, behind tapestries, in stairwells, in corners of the most beautiful rooms in France. The palace reeked so badly that visitors often fainted upon entering. But it gets infinitely worse when we talk about the royal women themselves, because while common courtiers might squat behind a curtain, queens and princesses had their own special waste management nightmare. They used chamber pots in full view of their ladies-in-waiting, and these pots were only emptied when they became completely full. Marie Antoinette's chamber pot routine was documented in excruciating detail by her lady-in-waiting, Madame Campan. The queen would use the same ornate golden chamber pot for days at a time, and it would sit in her bedroom, accumulating waste, until it was literally overflowing. Only then would servants be allowed to empty it, and this happened maybe once or twice per week. But here's where it gets truly revolting. Royal protocol demanded that these chamber pots be emptied by specific high-ranking courtiers as part of their official duties. At the English court, there was actually a position called Groom of the Stool, and it was considered one of the most prestigious jobs in the palace because it meant you had intimate access to the monarch. The Groom of the Stool wasn't just responsible for emptying chamber pots. They were required to inspect the royal waste for signs of illness, document its colour and consistency, and report any changes to the royal physicians. These reports still exist in palace archives, and they contain detailed descriptions of royal bowel movements that are absolutely mortifying to read. Henry VII's daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, elevated this waste inspection to an art form. Her Groom of the Stool, a woman named Blanche Parry, kept daily records of Elizabeth's bathroom habits for over 30 years. These records reveal that Elizabeth often went weeks without a bowel movement due to her terrible diet and lack of physical activity, leading to waste inspection sessions that Parry described as trials of extraordinary endurance. The smell situation in royal palaces was beyond description. Contemporary accounts describe the stench as being so overwhelming that courtiers would hold perfumed handkerchiefs over their faces at all times. The Spanish ambassador to Versailles wrote that the aroma of human waste permeates every corridor, every chamber, every breath of air within these golden walls. But the most disturbing aspect of royal waste management was what happened during formal ceremonies. Royal women couldn't leave important state functions to use the bathroom. Royal protocol forbade interrupting ceremonies for personal needs, so they developed what can only be described as the most disgusting solution imaginable. During lengthy court ceremonies, which could last for 6 to 8 hours, royal women would wear what they called relief garments, essentially medieval diapers made of linen and wool that would absorb their waste during public events. They would sit through entire state dinners, treaty signings, and diplomatic receptions while soiling themselves, because leaving would have been a diplomatic insult. The cleanup process after these formal events was absolutely horrifying. Teams of servants would have to carefully remove these soiled garments from royal women and clean them while the ladies remained standing. This process, called the evening restoration, often took hours and required multiple servants working in shifts because the smell was so overwhelming. Catherine de' Medici was notorious for her formal event accidents. Italian diplomatic records describe her soiling herself during a 4-hour peace treaty negotiation with Spain, then continuing the diplomatic discussion while sitting in her own waste because leaving would have implied that Spain's proposals weren't worth her full attention. The royal dining situation made everything worse. These palace dining halls had no ventilation systems, so the smell of accumulated human waste would mix with food odors during meals. Diplomatic banquets at Versailles were famous for causing foreign dignitaries to vomit at the table, not from the food, but from the overwhelming stench of human waste that permeated the dining experience. Palace waste disposal was handled by teams of servants called night soil men, who would collect the accumulated waste from chamber pots, relief garments, and random palace corners during the overnight hours. These men had the highest mortality rate of any palace workers because exposure to human waste led to constant illness and disease. The waste disposal process itself was medieval. All palace waste was dumped into enormous pits dug outside the palace walls, creating what were essentially lakes of human sewage. During hot summer months, the smell from these waste pits would drift back into the palace, making the indoor air even more unbreathable. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of this entire waste nightmare was how it affected international diplomacy. Foreign ambassadors would often cut their visits short because they literally couldn't tolerate the sanitary conditions in royal palaces. Trade negotiations failed because diplomatic delegations would become too ill from the waste exposure to continue talks. The Russian ambassador to Versailles in 1717 wrote that conducting diplomacy in these conditions requires the constitution of a soldier and the stomach of a peasant. I fear for the future of international relations if such environments become the standard for royal courts. Royal women themselves seemed almost immune to these horrific conditions, but only because they had lived with them their entire lives. They had developed what court physicians called palace nose, the condition where prolonged exposure to waste odors had essentially destroyed their ability to smell normally. Marie Antoinette's physician noted that the queen had lost most of her sense of smell by age 25 due to constant exposure to waste odors in palace environments. This condition was so common among royal women that having a functional sense of smell was actually seen as a sign that someone was new to court life. The tragic irony is that these royal women were living in palaces that cost more than entire national budgets, wearing gowns worth fortunes, eating off golden plates, yet they were essentially living in conditions worse than most farm animals. The disconnect between their magnificent public image and their revolting private reality was absolutely staggering. But even as these queens were navigating their daily waste management nightmares, there was another assault on their senses happening simultaneously. Because while their palaces reeked of human waste, they were fighting back with perfume applications so extreme and overwhelming that they created an entirely different kind of olfactory horror. The battle against their own stench led royal women to commit acts of perfume violence that were truly breathtaking in their excess. We're not talking about a delicate spritz of Chanel. We're talking about perfume applications so extreme that they created their own health crises and literally poisoned the air around these queens. Catherine de' Medici didn't just wear perfume, she weaponized it. This woman used so much fragrance that contemporary accounts describe her arrival at social gatherings as being preceded by a wall of scent that would hit people before she even entered the room. She employed a team of 16 perfumers whose sole job was to keep her saturated in fragrance from dawn until midnight. But here's where Catherine's perfume obsession turned deadly. She began experimenting with perfumed gloves that were soaked in solutions containing not just fragrant oils, but actual poisons. These weren't just beauty accessories. They were potential murder weapons disguised as fashion statements. She would give these perfume gloves as gifts to political enemies, knowing that the extended skin contact would slowly poison the recipients. The most shocking case involved Jeanne d'Albret, Queen of Navarre, who died after wearing a pair of Catherine's perfumed gloves for just 3 days. The gloves were soaked in a mixture of musk, ambergris, and arsenic. creating a deadly combination that smelled divine while slowly killing the wearer. When Jean's body was examined, investigators found chemical burns on her hands that matched the exact pattern of the glove's lace trim. But Catherine wasn't the only royal woman drowning herself in dangerous fragrances. Marie Antoinette's perfume consumption was so extreme that the French treasury actually had a separate budget line item just for her fragrance expenses. She went through approximately 12 bottles of concentrated perfume per week. That's nearly 2 bottles per day. Marie Antoinette's morning perfume ritual was absolutely insane. Her ladies-in-waiting would begin by soaking her entire body with rose water. Not just sprinkling, but literally pouring gallons of scented water over her skin. Then they would apply concentrated perfume oils to every inch of her body using sponges and brushes, building up layers of different scents like some kind of olfactory lasagna. The process took over 2 hours every morning and used enough perfume to scent a modern department store. Her perfume bills from 1785 show purchases of over 300 bottles of concentrated essence in a single month. To put that in perspective, she was using more perfume in a month than most people today use in their entire lifetime. But the really disturbing part was how this extreme perfume use affected everyone around her. Servants working in Marie Antoinette's chambers regularly fainted from what court physicians called fragrance poisoning, a condition caused by inhaling too much concentrated perfume in enclosed spaces. The Queen's personal chamber had to be aired out for hours each day just to make it safe for human occupancy. The perfume competition between royal women became absolutely cutthroat. They weren't just trying to smell good. They were trying to create scent signatures so powerful and distinctive that they could dominate any social gathering through sheer olfactory force. It was like chemical warfare disguised as elegance. Diane de Poitiers, Henry II's mistress, famously created what she called her scent armor, a perfume blend so strong that it could be detected from over 100 feet away. She would arrive at court functions like a perfumed hurricane, literally forcing other nobles to retreat to the far sides of rooms to escape her overwhelming fragrance cloud. The ingredients used in these royal perfumes were often more expensive than gold, and just as dangerous. Ambergris, which comes from whale intestines and cost more per ounce than precious gems, was mixed with musk from exotic animals, rare flowers that bloomed only in specific climates, and often toxic substances like mercury and lead that were believed to make fragrances last longer. But here's what really blows my mind. Many of these royal perfumes were specifically designed to mask the smell of death and disease, as these women's bodies began to deteriorate from their toxic beauty routines, poor diets, and unsanitary living conditions. Their natural body odors became increasingly horrific. So they would apply stronger and stronger perfumes to cover up the fact that they were literally rotting from the inside out. Queen Mary of England, also known as Bloody Mary, developed what court observers described as a corpse-like odor during her final years, probably due to the uterine cancer that eventually killed her. Her response? She began using a perfume blend that contained so much musk and civet that ambassadors complained it made their eyes water and caused severe headaches during audiences. The French court developed an entire perfume hierarchy based on social rank. Lower nobles were only allowed to use certain scents, while higher-ranking royal women had exclusive access to the most potent and expensive fragrances. Breaking these perfume protocols was considered a serious social offense that could result in banishment from court. But the most bizarre aspect of this perfume obsession was how it affected royal decision-making. These women were conducting affairs of state while essentially high on perfume fumes. The chemical effects of inhaling massive amounts of concentrated fragrance daily caused everything from severe headaches to hallucinations to respiratory problems. Marie de Medici's physician noted that the Queen often experienced what he called perfume madness, episodes where the chemical overload from her fragrance use would cause temporary insanity. She would become convinced that people were trying to poison her through their scents, and would demand that everyone in her presence undergo scent purification before approaching her. The economic impact of royal perfume consumption was staggering. The French perfume industry essentially existed to serve the insane fragrance demands of Versailles. Entire ships would arrive from exotic locations, carrying nothing but rare perfume ingredients for the royal court. The cost of keeping Marie Antoinette properly perfumed was equivalent to maintaining a small army. Contemporary accounts describe diplomatic meetings where the combined perfume clouds of various royal women would create a fog so thick that people couldn't see across conference tables. Foreign ambassadors would literally need to hold perfumed handkerchiefs over their faces just to breathe during negotiations. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of this perfume mania was that it never actually solved the underlying problem. Despite drowning themselves in the most expensive fragrances in the world, these royal women still smelled terrible underneath it all. They were essentially creating olfactory chaos, combining the worst body odors imaginable with overwhelming chemical fragrances to create scent combinations that were somehow worse than either smell alone. The health consequences were severe and long-lasting. Royal women who survived into old age often suffered from permanent respiratory damage caused by decades of perfume inhalation. Their sense of smell was completely destroyed. Their lungs were scarred, and many developed chronic breathing problems that made their final years even more miserable. Yet even as these queens were suffocating themselves and everyone around them with toxic fragrance clouds, there was another aspect of their monthly lives that was so shocking and barbaric that it makes perfume poisoning seem like a minor inconvenience. Because when it came to dealing with their natural biological cycles, royal women faced challenges that were both deeply personal and utterly horrifying. Every month, royal women faced what was considered the ultimate shame and danger of female existence, their menstrual cycles. But the medieval solutions to this natural biological process were so horrifying and unsanitary that they make everything we've discussed so far seem almost civilized by comparison. Medieval and Renaissance royal women had no access to anything resembling modern menstrual products. Instead, they used what were essentially rags, pieces of old linen, wool, or whatever fabric they could find, that they would stuff between their legs and hope for the best. These makeshift solutions were called clouts, and they were about as effective as you'd imagine. But here's what makes this truly shocking. These royal women would use the same clouts for their entire menstrual cycle, sometimes for 7 to 10 days, without washing or changing them. They would simply add more layers of fabric as the existing ones became saturated, creating what can only be described as a medieval menstrual nightmare. Queen Catherine of Aragon's personal accounts, discovered in the Spanish archives, reveal the disturbing reality of royal period management. She describes using the same set of linen clouts for her entire cycle, washing them only at the very end when they had become completely unusable. The smell and discomfort she endured during her monthly cycles contributed to what court physicians called her a melancholic humours. The religious implications made everything worse. The medieval Catholic Church considered menstruating women to be unclean and cursed by God. Royal women during their periods were forbidden from entering churches, participating in religious ceremonies, or even touching holy objects. They were essentially quarantined in special chambers called red tents, where they would remain isolated until their cycles ended. Marie de Medici spent 1 week out of every month locked away in what the French court called La Chambre Rouge, the Red Chamber. This wasn't just social isolation. It was complete banishment from royal duties. During these periods, she couldn't conduct state business, meet with advisors, or even see her own children. She was treated like a diseased person who might contaminate everything she touched. The isolation chambers themselves were absolutely medieval. These rooms had no windows, minimal furniture, and were considered so contaminated by menstrual presence that they had to be fumigated with burning herbs after each use. Royal women would spend 7 days in these dark, stuffy chambers with minimal food and water, because even their servants were afraid to enter and risk contamination. But the most disturbing aspect was how royal periods affected international diplomacy. Important negotiations would be postponed, treaties delayed, and state visits rescheduled whenever royal women entered their monthly cycles. The Spanish ambassador to the English court wrote in 1583 that the Queen's monthly indisposition has delayed our trade negotiations for the third consecutive month, as Her Majesty cannot be approached during these times of female corruption. The medical treatments prescribed for royal menstruation were absolutely horrifying. Court physicians believed that menstrual blood was toxic and needed to be purged from the body as quickly as possible. They would prescribe powerful laxatives, emetics, and bloodletting treatments to cleanse royal women during their cycles, essentially torturing them while they were already suffering. Queen Elizabeth's own physician, Dr. John Dee, prescribed a monthly treatment that involved bleeding her from both arms, while simultaneously giving her mercury-based purges to expel the corrupted humours. Elizabeth would endure this additional torture every month for decades, believing it was necessary to prevent the menstrual blood from poisoning her entire system. The hygiene situation during royal periods was beyond description. Without proper absorption or containment, menstrual blood would stain clothing, furniture, and bed linens. Royal laundresses developed special techniques for dealing with what they euphemistically called monthly stains. But these cleaning methods involved harsh loo solutions that often damaged expensive fabrics beyond repair. Catherine de' Medici's household accounts show enormous expenses for replacing bed linens, cushions, and even throne covers that had been permanently stained during her menstrual cycles. The French court actually budgeted for monthly fabric replacement costs because the staining was so extensive and the cleaning methods so destructive. The smell situation was unimaginable. Unwashed menstrual rags, combined with the already horrific palace odours we've discussed, created an olfactory assault that was described by contemporary accounts as the scent of death itself. During royal women's periods, entire sections of palaces would become uninhabitable due to the overwhelming stench. But perhaps the most tragic aspect was how menstruation affected royal women's self-perception and mental health. They genuinely believed they were cursed, contaminated, and dangerous to others during their cycles. This monthly shame and isolation for decades of their lives contributed to severe psychological trauma that affected their ability to rule effectively. Anne of Cleves wrote in her private diary about the monthly curse that makes me unworthy of God's love and man's respect. She described feeling like a diseased animal during her periods and developed severe depression that court physicians attributed to her corrupted female nature, rather than the horrific conditions she was forced to endure. The practical challenges were equally overwhelming. Royal women wearing elaborate gowns with multiple layers couldn't easily access or change their makeshift menstrual protection. They would often go entire days with saturated, uncomfortable clouts, because changing them required the assistance of multiple servants and could take over an hour to accomplish properly. The French court developed elaborate protocols for monthly assistance that required teams of specially trained servants who were considered permanently contaminated by their exposure to menstrual blood. These servants were paid extra wages but were socially ostracized and forbidden from working in other areas of the palace because they were considered spiritually tainted. Royal dining during menstruation was its own nightmare. Women couldn't cook food, serve meals, or even eat at the same table as men during their cycles because their touch was believed to spoil food and contaminate others. They would eat alone, served by their contaminated servants, often surviving on bread and water because elaborate meal preparation was considered too dangerous. The international implications were staggering. Royal marriages were often delayed because brides couldn't travel during their periods. The journey was considered too dangerous for contaminated women. Foreign princesses would sometimes wait months for safe travel windows, causing diplomatic tensions between kingdoms. But the most shocking discovery came from examining the mortality rates of royal women. Modern analysis of historical records shows that royal women had significantly higher rates of reproductive health problems, infections, and early death compared to common women who had access to basic washing facilities and clean rags for menstrual care. The irony is heartbreaking. These women had access to unlimited wealth, the finest medical care available, and armies of servants. Yet they suffered through their most basic biological functions in conditions worse than medieval peasants. Because while poor women might use simple clean rags and wash them in rivers, royal women were trapped by religious taboos and medical misinformation that made their monthly cycles into prolonged ordeals of shame, isolation, and unsanitary suffering. Yet even as these queens endured monthly cycles of humiliation and discomfort, there was one aspect of royal female life that was even more dangerous and disgusting: the process of bringing new life into the world. Because royal childbirth practices were so barbaric and unsanitary that they turned what should have been joyful occasions into scenes of medieval horror. When royal women gave birth, they entered what can only be described as a medieval chamber of horrors, disguised as a celebration of new life. The childbirth practices in royal courts were so unsanitary and dangerous that they killed more queens than war, diseases, and political assassinations combined. We're talking about delivery procedures that would horrify a modern veterinarian. Royal birthing chambers were sealed environments where no fresh air was allowed to enter, because court physicians believed that outside air would contaminate the birth process. These rooms were kept deliberately hot and stuffy, with heavy tapestries covering every window and door. The lack of ventilation, combined with the presence of dozens of unwashed attendants, created breeding grounds for deadly bacteria that modern science recognizes as the perfect storm for infection. Jane Seymour, Henry VII's third wife, died 12 days after giving birth to the future Edward VI, almost certainly from what we now know as puerperal sepsis, an infection caused by the horrifically unsanitary conditions in her birthing chamber. The official court records describe her delivery as taking place in a room where no cleansing breeze was permitted to disturb the sacred process, meaning she gave birth in a sealed, bacteria-laden environment. But the unsanitary conditions were just the beginning of the horror. Royal women were attended by midwives and physicians who never washed their hands, used unsterilized instruments, and often went directly from handling corpses to delivering babies. These medical attendants would examine multiple women in labor using the same unwashed hands and contaminated tools, spreading deadly infections from one royal birth to another. The most shocking example is Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis's research at Vienna General Hospital in the 1840s, where he discovered that the ward attended by doctors had a maternal mortality rate of 18%, while the ward attended by midwives had a rate of only 2%. The difference: the doctors were coming directly from autopsy rooms to delivery chambers without washing their hands, literally carrying death from corpses to newborn babies. Royal birthing practices included what they called opening the matrix, a procedure where physicians would manually examine the cervix with unwashed hands, often introducing deadly bacteria directly into the birth canal. Catherine of Aragon endured this procedure during each of her 6 pregnancies, and historical accounts suggest that the repeated infections from these examinations contributed to her multiple miscarriages and stillbirths. The instruments used in royal deliveries were medieval torture devices masquerading as medical tools: iron forceps that had never been properly cleaned, sharp hooks for extracting stuck babies, and something called a crochet, essentially a sharp metal hook used to dismember babies who had died in the womb. These instruments were passed from one royal birth to another without any sterilization, carrying infections and contamination with them. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect of royal childbirth was the lying-in period that followed delivery. After giving birth, royal women were required to remain in bed for 30 to 40 days without bathing, changing clothes, or even sitting up properly. They would lie in the same blood-stained sheets where they had delivered, developing bed sores, infections, and what court physicians called childbed fever. Rita Medici's lying-in period after the birth of the future Louis XV was documented in excruciating detail by her ladies-in-waiting. She remained in the same bed for 37 days, wearing the same blood-soaked chemise throughout the entire period. Court records describe the smell in her chamber as being so overwhelming that servants had to be rotated every few hours to prevent them from fainting. The religious requirements made everything worse. Royal women were considered unclean after childbirth and couldn't be purified until they had completed their lying-in period and undergone special cleansing ceremonies. This meant they couldn't wash, change clothes, or receive proper medical care for over a month after delivery, the exact time when post-birth infections were most likely to develop. The mortality statistics are absolutely staggering. Modern analysis of royal genealogical records shows that royal women had a maternal mortality rate of nearly 25%, meaning 1 in 4 royal mothers died from complications related to childbirth. This was significantly higher than the mortality rate for common women, who had access to cleaner birthing environments and traditional midwifery practices. Catherine of Aragon's obstetric history reads like a medical horror story. 6 pregnancies, multiple miscarriages, 1 surviving child, and constant suffering from what court physicians called womb sickness. Almost certainly chronic infections caused by the unsanitary birthing practices she endured repeatedly. Her personal physician's notes describe her as suffering from putrid discharges and corrupted humours that plagued her for years after each failed pregnancy. But the contamination wasn't limited to the mothers. Royal babies born in these conditions had incredibly high mortality rates due to infections contracted during delivery. The same unwashed hands and contaminated instruments that threatened the mothers also exposed newborn infants to deadly bacteria from the moment of birth. The French royal family provides a particularly tragic example. Marie Antoinette's first 3 children were delivered in conditions so unsanitary that contemporary accounts describe the birthing chamber as smelling like a charnel house where the living and dead mingle. 2 of her 4 children died in infancy from what court physicians attributed to corrupted birthing humours, almost certainly infections contracted during delivery. Royal birthing chambers were also public spectacles, with dozens of courtiers, diplomats, and officials crowding into already contaminated spaces to witness the delivery. These crowds of unwashed observers would bring additional germs and bacteria into the birthing environment while consuming food and wine during the lengthy labour process, creating party atmospheres around medical emergencies. The Duke of Saint-Simon wrote about attending the birth of one of Louis XIV's grandchildren, describing a scene where nobles feast and gamble in the same chamber where Her Highness suffers the pangs of labour, their revelries mixing with her cries of anguish. The combination of celebration and medical crisis created chaotic environments where proper hygiene was impossible to maintain. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of royal childbirth was how these intelligent, powerful women were completely helpless in the face of medical practices that were killing them. They knew the dangers. Royal libraries were filled with accounts of maternal deaths, yet they had no choice but to submit to the same deadly procedures that had killed their mothers, sisters, and friends. Anne of Cleves wrote in her private letters about the terror that grips my heart when I consider the childbed chamber, describing her fear of the birthing process based on witnessing the deaths of other royal women. Yet when she did become pregnant, she was forced to endure the same unsanitary conditions that had claimed so many lives before her. The economic cost of royal maternal mortality was enormous. Kingdoms would invest decades training and positioning royal women for strategic marriages and political alliances, only to lose these valuable assets to preventable birthing complications. The death of a queen during childbirth could destabilize entire political systems and derail international diplomatic arrangements. But even as royal women were dying from unsanitary birthing practices, there was another aspect of their daily lives that was equally shocking and disgusting. Because when these queens sat down to eat their elaborate royal meals, the hygiene practices surrounding food and dining were so revolting that they make childbirth contamination seem almost manageable by comparison. Royal dining was a spectacle of golden plates and priceless goblets, hiding one of the most disgusting food hygiene disasters in human history. These elaborate feasts that we see romanticized in period dramas were actually breeding grounds for disease, contamination, and eating practices so revolting that they would shut down any modern restaurant within hours. Let's start with the most basic issue. Royal women never wash their hands before eating. Ever. This wasn't an oversight. It was actually considered proper etiquette. Medieval medical theory taught that washing hands before meals would remove the body's natural protective oils and make diners more susceptible to food poisoning. So these queens would sit down to elaborate banquets with hands that hadn't seen soap and water in months. Queen Elizabeth's dining habits were documented in horrifying detail by her courtiers. She would eat directly with her hands, which, remember, were covered in months of accumulated dirt, makeup residue, and whatever diseases she'd been exposed to, and then use those same contaminated hands to serve food to honoured guests as a mark of royal favour. Being personally fed by the Queen was considered the highest honour, but it was basically a guaranteed way to contract whatever illnesses were festering on her unwashed fingers. But the hand-washing situation was nothing compared to the utensil-sharing nightmare. Royal feasts operated on a communal utensil system where dozens of people would use the same knives, spoons, and cups throughout an entire meal. There was no individual place setting. Everything was shared, and nothing was cleaned between users. The famous loving cup tradition, where a single goblet would be passed around an entire banquet table with each person drinking from it, was essentially a disease distribution system disguised as a bonding ritual. Contemporary accounts describe these shared cups being passed between people suffering from everything from tuberculosis to syphilis to plague, creating what modern epidemiologists would recognize as super spreader events. Marie Antoinette's dinner parties were particularly notorious for their disease transmission potential. Her favorite dining ritual involved using the same golden spoon to taste multiple dishes, and then offering taste to her guests using that same contaminated utensil. Court records show that entire diplomatic delegations would fall ill within days of dining at Versailles, often with identical symptoms that could be traced back to these shared utensil practices. The food preparation situation was even more horrifying than the dining practices. Royal kitchens operated without any understanding of temperature control, food safety, or contamination prevention. Meat would hang in palace kitchens for weeks, developing what cooks called noble rot, essentially advanced decomposition that was considered a sign of proper aging. Catherine de' Medici's head chef, a man named Maestro Martino, kept detailed records of food preparation that read like a horror novel. He described serving meat that had been hanging in palace kitchens for up to 6 weeks during summer months, developing green mold and producing what he euphemistically called robust aromas. This rotting meat wasn't considered spoiled. It was considered aged to perfection. The spicing practices were designed to mask the taste and smell of rotting food rather than preserve it. Royal dishes were so heavily spiced that diners often couldn't taste the underlying ingredients, which was probably a mercy given the state of decomposition most royal food had reached by the time it was served. But perhaps the most disgusting aspect of royal dining was the practice of tasting for poison. Except the tasters weren't just checking for deliberate poisoning, they were unknowingly serving as early warning systems for food poisoning from naturally contaminated ingredients. If the taster didn't immediately collapse, the food was considered safe, regardless of what bacterial nightmares might be lurking in it. The communal dining bowls used at royal feasts were breeding grounds for every disease imaginable. These large serving vessels would sit on tables for hours during lengthy banquets, with dozens of people reaching in with unwashed hands, contaminated utensils, and sometimes even their mouths to taste directly from the serving dishes. Royal women had a particularly disgusting habit of using bread as both food and napkin. They would tear off pieces of bread to clean their hands and faces during meals, then eat those same bread pieces that were now contaminated with whatever filth they'd just wiped away. This bread napkin system meant they were literally eating their own accumulated dirt and contamination throughout the meal. The wine situation was equally revolting. Royal wine was often stored in containers that hadn't been properly cleaned in years, developing what vintners called cellar character, actually bacterial contamination that gave the wine distinctive flavors. Some royal wines were so contaminated that they had visible mold floating on the surface, but this was considered a sign of authenticity rather than spoilage. Catherine of Aragon's physician noted that the Queen suffered from chronic stomach ailments that he attributed to corrupted dining humours. But modern analysis of his descriptions suggests she was suffering from constant food poisoning, caused by the horrific hygiene practices at royal meals. The disposal of food waste during royal banquets created additional contamination hazards, Leftover food, bones, and scraps would be thrown directly onto the floor around the dining table, where they would attract rats, insects, and other vermin that would then contaminate the remaining food on the table. Some royal banquets would last for 6 to 8 hours, meaning diners were eating surrounded by piles of rotting food waste. But the most shocking dining practice was something called mouth honor, where royal women would chew food and then spit it directly into the mouths of favored courtiers as a sign of affection and status. This practice, documented at multiple European courts, was essentially direct disease transmission disguised as royal favor. Royal pregnancy dining created its own special category of horror. Pregnant royal women were encouraged to eat raw meat and drink wine heavily, because these were considered necessary for healthy fetal development. The combination of alcohol consumption and raw, contaminated meat created perfect conditions for foodborne illnesses that threatened both mother and child. The social pressure to finish everything served at royal banquets meant that royal women would continue eating even when food was obviously spoiled. Leaving food uneaten was considered an insult to the host, so queens would force down visibly moldy bread, rancid meat, and fermented vegetables rather than risk causing diplomatic offence. Kitchen hygiene in royal palaces was non-existent. Cooks worked with unwashed hands, used contaminated cutting surfaces, and stored food in conditions that would horrify modern health inspectors. The same cutting boards used for raw meat would be used for bread, vegetables, and desserts without any cleaning between uses. The irony is absolutely mind-blowing. These royal women were eating off plates worth more than entire kingdoms, surrounded by the finest luxury money could buy. Yet they were consuming food prepared and served in conditions that would be rejected by modern prison systems. They were literally eating themselves into illness and early death while believing they were enjoying the finest cuisine in the world. Food poisoning was so common at royal banquets that court physicians kept special remedies on hand for what they called feast sickness. These remedies usually involved more toxic substances like mercury and lead, meaning royal women were being poisoned by both their food and their medicine simultaneously. As we've seen throughout this shocking journey, the gap between royal appearance and royal reality was never wider than it appeared in their daily lives. But when we step back and compare these horrific historical practices with modern standards, the contrast becomes so extreme that it challenges everything we thought we knew about the glamorous world of royalty. The moment you step back and compare royal hygiene practices with modern standards, the contrast becomes so shocking that it fundamentally changes how you view both historical royalty and contemporary life. What we've uncovered isn't just ancient history, it's a window into how dramatically human standards of cleanliness, health, and dignity have evolved over the centuries. Let me put this into perspective for you. The average American today brushes their teeth twice daily, showers regularly, changes underwear daily, and follows basic hygiene practices that would have been considered impossible luxury, or even dangerous, by royal standards just 300 years ago. A minimum wage worker at McDonald's today has access to better hygiene facilities than Queen Elizabeth II, who ruled the most powerful empire on earth. Think about this. You probably used more soap this morning than Marie Antoinette used in her entire lifetime. Your daily shower uses more clean water than most royal palaces saw in months. The basic hygiene products in your bathroom cabinet, toothbrush, toothpaste, deodorant, shampoo, represent technologies and concepts that were completely unknown to the most powerful women in history. But here's what really blows my mind. Modern homeless shelters have hygiene standards that would have been considered impossibly luxurious by royal courts. Free public restrooms and gas stations offer better sanitation than the Palace of Versailles. Your local community college has bathroom facilities that would have shocked medieval queens into unconsciousness. The health implications of this comparison are staggering. Modern Americans have an average life expectancy of around 76 years, while royal women, despite having access to the best food, medicine, and living conditions of their time, rarely lived past 50. Queen Elizabeth died at 69 and was considered remarkably long-lived for her era. Today, 69 is barely considered elderly. The dental health comparison is particularly shocking. Modern Americans spend an average of $1,200 per year on dental care, and we still complain about expensive dental bills. But contemporary dental hygiene practices, daily brushing, flossing, regular cleanings, would have prevented virtually all of the horrific dental problems that plagued royal women. A basic toothbrush and fluoride toothpaste would have revolutionized royal health. But it's not just about physical health, it's about dignity and quality of life. Modern women during their menstrual cycles had access to products and privacy that would have seemed miraculous to royal women who suffered through monthly cycles of shame, isolation, and unsanitary conditions. The simple box of tampons represents more advanced feminine hygiene technology than entire royal courts could provide. The childbirth comparison is heartbreaking. Modern American maternal mortality rates are approximately 0.02%, meaning 99.98% of births result in healthy mothers. Royal women faced maternal mortality rates of 25%, meaning 1 in 4 royal mothers died from complications that would be easily preventable today, with basic sterilization and modern medical knowledge. Even our understanding of basic nutrition makes royal dining practices seem primitive. Modern food safety regulations, refrigeration, and preservation techniques mean that the average American has access to fresher, safer food than royal banquets could provide. Your local grocery store operates under hygiene standards that would have been incomprehensible to royal chefs. The psychological impact of this comparison is profound. Modern women can participate fully in society regardless of their biological cycles, health conditions, or personal hygiene needs. Royal women were essentially prisoners of their own bodies, constrained by medical misinformation, religious taboos, and social expectations that made their most basic biological functions into sources of shame and isolation. But perhaps the most striking difference is in personal choice and autonomy. Modern women can choose their own hygiene practices, medical treatments, and lifestyle decisions. Royal women were trapped by court protocols, medical theories, and social expectations that forced them to endure practices they knew were uncomfortable, dangerous, or ineffective. The economic aspect is equally mind-blowing. Modern hygiene products that cost a few dollars, soap, shampoo, toothpaste, deodorant, provide better cleanliness and health outcomes than the most expensive royal beauty treatments. A $5 bottle of shampoo works better than the elaborate hair powdering systems that cost royal treasuries thousands of dollars. Yet there's also something deeply humbling about this comparison. These royal women weren't stupid or ignorant. They were operating within the best knowledge available to their time. They were following medical advice, religious teachings, and social customs that were considered advanced and sophisticated. In 300 years, future generations might look back at our current practices with similar horror and disbelief. The technological revolution that created modern hygiene happened gradually, but its impact was revolutionary. Indoor plumbing, soap manufacturing, understanding of germ theory, development of antibiotics, and modern chemistry transformed human hygiene from royal nightmare to everyday routine. What once required armies of servants and massive royal budgets is now accomplished with products available at any corner store. But the social implications are equally important. Modern society has separated cleanliness from moral judgment, removed religious taboos from natural biological functions, and created systems where hygiene is considered a basic human right rather than a luxury privilege. The shame and isolation that royal women endured around their most basic bodily functions would be considered human rights violations today. The educational aspect is crucial too. Modern women have access to accurate information about health, hygiene, and medical care that allows them to make informed decisions about their bodies. Royal women were trapped by medical misinformation, religious superstition, and social expectations that prevented them from understanding or improving their own health conditions. This comparison also reveals how much progress we've made in understanding women's health specifically. Modern medicine recognizes that women's biological functions are normal and healthy, not shameful or dangerous. The medical establishment that once prescribed toxic treatments for normal female biology has evolved into healthcare systems that support women's health and well-being. The most powerful realization from this comparison is that the luxury and privilege we associate with royalty was often an illusion. These women had access to incredible wealth, political power, and social status, yet they lived in conditions that would be considered inhumane by modern standards. True luxury isn't about golden plates and silk gowns. It's about basic human dignity, health, and comfort. As we reach the end of our shocking journey through royal hygiene disasters, it's worth reflecting on how these historical practices shaped not just individual lives, but entire civilizations. Because the legacy of royal filth extends far beyond personal discomfort. It influenced politics, diplomacy, medical development, and social progress in ways that continue to affect us today. The consequences of royal hygiene disasters extended far beyond personal discomfort. They literally shaped the course of world history in ways that continue to impact us today. These weren't just individual stories of suffering. They were systemic failures that influenced wars, toppled governments, and fundamentally altered the development of human civilization. Consider how royal hygiene affected international diplomacy. The Congress of Vienna in 1815, which redrew the map of Europe after Napoleon's defeat, was significantly influenced by hygiene considerations. Diplomatic negotiations were regularly interrupted or relocated because the personal hygiene of various royal representatives made extended meetings impossible. The Russian delegation actually threatened to withdraw from crucial territorial discussions because they couldn't tolerate the body odor of certain European monarchs. But the most profound impact was on political decision-making itself. When we examine the erratic behavior of various royal rulers throughout history, we now understand that many decisions that seemed irrational or impulsive were actually the result of chronic pain, infection, and toxic exposure from their hygiene practices. The lead poisoning from makeup, mercury exposure from medical treatments, and constant infections from poor sanitation created a ruling class that was literally being poisoned into poor judgment. Queen Elizabeth I's famous indecision during the Spanish Armada crisis in 1588 may have been influenced by lead poisoning from her daily makeup routine. Her vacillation between different military strategies, which historians have long attributed to political caution, shows patterns consistent with lead-induced cognitive impairment. The same toxins that were destroying her teeth and skin were also affecting her ability to make clear, decisive choices that could have changed the course of English history. The demographic impact was equally staggering. Royal women's high mortality rates from hygiene-related complications meant that political alliances built around marriages were constantly being disrupted. When a young queen died from preventable infections, it didn't just affect her immediate family. It could destabilize entire kingdoms and shift the balance of power across Europe. The economic consequences were mind-boggling. European kingdoms spent enormous portions of their treasuries on medical treatments, beauty products, and hygiene-related services that were not only ineffective but actively harmful. The French royal household spent more on perfumes, toxic cosmetics, and medical treatments than on entire military campaigns. Resources that could have been used for infrastructure, education, or economic development were instead poured into hygiene practices that were killing the very people they were meant to help. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect is how royal hygiene disasters actually accelerated human progress. The horrific conditions in royal courts created such obvious problems that they eventually sparked the development of modern medicine, sanitation systems, and public health initiatives. The very extremes of royal filth made it impossible to ignore the connection between cleanliness and health. The Great Stink of London in 1858, which forced the British government to invest in modern sewage systems, was largely motivated by the realization that even royal palaces couldn't escape the health consequences of poor sanitation. When cholera outbreaks began affecting noble families alongside commoners, it became clear that disease didn't respect social hierarchies. The development of modern nursing practices was directly influenced by observations of royal medical disasters. Florence Nightingale's revolutionary sanitation practices during the Crimean War were partly inspired by her horror at the medical conditions she'd witnessed in European royal courts. She recognized that the same hygiene principles that could save soldiers' lives could also prevent the types of infections that had been killing royal women for centuries. Medical breakthroughs in sterilization, anesthesia, and surgical techniques were often driven by the need to address problems that had been plaguing royal families for generations. The development of antiseptic surgery by Joseph Lister was motivated partly by the shocking maternal mortality rates among European nobility, where the wealthiest women in society were dying from preventable infections. The social implications were equally profound. As information about royal hygiene disasters began to spread, it fundamentally changed how people viewed authority, privilege, and social hierarchy. The revelation that queens and princesses lived in conditions worse than many peasants helped fuel democratic movements and social revolutions across Europe. The French Revolution was influenced not just by economic inequality, but by the growing awareness of how the aristocracy actually lived. When common people learned that Marie Antoinette rarely bathed, wore the same undergarments for months, and lived surrounded by human waste, it became harder to maintain the mystique of royal superiority that had supported monarchical systems for centuries. But there's also a deeply human lesson in these stories. These royal women were trapped by systems, expectations, and knowledge limitations that prevented them from living healthy, dignified lives despite having access to incredible wealth and power. Their suffering reminds us that true progress isn't just about accumulating resources. It's about developing knowledge, challenging harmful traditions, and creating systems that support human well-being. The transformation from royal hygiene disasters to modern cleanliness standards represents one of humanity's greatest achievements. In just a few centuries, we've gone from a world where the most powerful women lived in conditions we'd consider inhumane to a world where basic hygiene is considered a fundamental human right. Yet their legacy continues to influence us today. Modern public health systems, medical regulations, and sanitation standards all exist partly because of the lessons learned from historical hygiene disasters. Every time you turn on a tap, use a clean bathroom, or visit a sterile hospital, you're benefiting from developments that were sparked by the recognition that the old ways of living were literally killing people. The stories of these royal women also remind us to question authority and challenge practices that seem normal but might be harmful. Just as these queens followed medical advice and social customs that were slowly destroying their health, we must remain vigilant about our own assumptions and practices. Perhaps most importantly, these stories teach us about resilience. Despite facing unimaginable discomfort, pain, and indignity, these royal women continued to rule kingdoms, make crucial decisions, and shape history. Their strength in the face of such adversity is truly remarkable, even if the conditions they endured were unnecessary and preventable. As we close this shocking journey through royal hygiene history, I want you to remember that these weren't just stories about the past. They're reminders of how far we've come and how much we should value the progress we've made. The next time you take a shower, brush your teeth, or change into clean clothes, take a moment to appreciate that you're living better than the most powerful queens in history. Thank you for joining me on this incredible, disgusting, and ultimately inspiring journey through the hidden truths of royal life. These stories remind us that history is far more complex and human than we often imagine, and that progress, even in something as basic as personal hygiene, requires constant effort and vigilance. I hope these tales have given you a new perspective on both historical royalty and modern life. Stay curious, stay questioning, and remember that the most glamorous appearances often hide the most shocking realities. Until our next journey into the surprising truths of history, keep exploring, keep learning, and most importantly, keep appreciating the incredible progress humanity has made in creating a cleaner, healthier, and more dignified world for all of us.